Wyoming Territory, October 1879. The wind howled off the Bighorn Mountains like it had a grudge. Calder Vance pulled his duster tighter around his frame and urged his horse forward, eyes squinting into sheets of rain and sleet. He had been riding hard for 2 days, heading toward Sheridan with a wagon of supplies hitched behind him when the storm rolled in fast and cruel. The trail had become mud, and the sky turned a mean gray. Still, he pressed on, jaw clenched against the cold, until something strange cut through the storm movement, small and slow, up ahead on the trail. He reined in his gelding and narrowed his eyes. A woman. Walking. She was soaked through, her skirts dragging in the mud, a bundle tucked against her chest wrapped in oilcloth. Her boots sank deep with every step, but she kept moving forward like the devil himself was behind her. Calder slid off his horse in a heartbeat. "Ma'am," he called over the wind. She turned fast, startled, her arms tightening around the bundle. "Please," she said, voice hoarse. "I just need to get to town." "You're not going to make it that way," Calder said, already moving toward her. He saw now the bundle was a baby. The child whimpered against her chest, face red from the cold. The woman's lips were blue. "I'll carry you the rest of the way," Calder said, no hesitation. "Come on." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the horse, to Calder, then back down the trail. "I do not know you," she said, voice shaking. "I know," Calder said gently, "but you're freezing and that baby is worse off. I swear on my life, ma'am, I will not hurt you. Let me help." She looked down again, then nodded once. "My name is Mara Lorne," she said quietly. "Calder Vance," he replied. "Let's get you both warm." He took the baby first, surprised by how light he felt in his arms. The child couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Calder wrapped his own wool scarf around the baby's head before lifting Mara up onto his horse. He climbed up behind her and wrapped one arm around her waist, holding the baby close to his chest with the other. "I have a wagon about a mile up," he said. "We can ride there and get dry." Mara leaned into him without answering, her body trembling. By the time they reached the wagon, her hands were stiff and barely moving. Calder helped her inside, propped her near the small cast iron stove he kept in the back, and got a fire going with kindling and coal. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders while she held the baby close again, rocking gently. "His name is Cade," she said softly. "He has not eaten since this morning. I had no milk left." "I've got some goat's milk," Calder said, already rummaging through a crate. "Not warm, but enough." She nodded, tears running silently down her face as he handed her a bottle he had used for a calf once. She tested it, then pressed it to Cade's lips. The baby drank greedily. Only once Cade was fed and asleep under a blanket did Mara let herself sink against the wagon's side. She looked at Calder, face pale and raw. "My husband died 2 months ago," she said. "Fever. We were headed to start over near Sheridan. I buried him outside Buffalo. Then the wagon broke down and I had no money left for repairs. No one would help a widow, so I walked. In this storm," Calder asked, his voice low. "I did not have a choice." He looked at her, really looked now. Her cheeks were gaunt. Her dress was threadbare, patched at the elbows. Her hands were calloused and cracked, but her eyes, they were still strong, still burning beneath all that hurt. "You do now," Calder said simply. "You are not walking anywhere again." She stared at him, blinking hard. "Why would you help me?" "Because someone should have already," he said. That night, the storm raged on outside, but inside the wagon it was warm. Calder had cooked beans and cornbread over the stove, and Mara had eaten slowly, her hands shaking as she fed herself with quiet grace. Cade slept wrapped in 3 blankets across the bench. They did not speak much. But when Mara dozed off beside the stove, Calder watched her for a long while. The lines on her face had eased. Her breathing was soft. She had fought her way through a storm with a baby in her arms, and she was still standing. That kind of strength stayed with a man. By morning, the storm had passed. Calder hitched the wagon and helped Mara and Cade onto the bench beside him. She sat stiffly at first, unsure, but by the time the sun broke through the clouds above the snow-dusted pines, she had relaxed a little. "How far to Sheridan?" she asked. 3 hours, Calder said. I have a cabin just west of town. It is small, but it is warm, and I have food. You can stay there if you want. She turned her head, studying him. You do not know me. I know enough, he said. She looked down at her hands in her lap. I do not want charity. It is not charity, Calder said. It is a place to rest and a man who knows what it means to lose something. I lost my brother 3 winters ago. I know what it feels like when the world forgets to look back at you. She was quiet a moment, then nodded. All right. The cabin sat low in a clearing, smoke curling from the chimney. The door creaked when Calder pushed it open. Inside was simple: a table, 2 chairs, a bed with a quilt, and shelves lined with jars of beans, dried fruit, and flour. There was even a cradle tucked in the corner, carved by his brother's hands before he passed. As soon as he set Cade down in it, Mara's hand went to her mouth. He made this, she whispered. Calder nodded. Never got to use it. She knelt beside the cradle and brushed her hand over the smooth wood. It is beautiful. He watched her, something quiet blooming in his chest. Over the next days, Mara began to come back to life. She cleaned the cabin with a care that made Calder's chest ache. She cooked meals that reminded him of his mother's kitchen. She sang to Cade soft and low in the evenings, the kind of tune that made even the wind outside seem to pause. And Calder, for the first time in years, looked forward to coming in from the cold. He fixed up the shed one afternoon, hammering new boards along the wall. Mara came out with a cup of coffee. You work hard, she said. I like keeping busy. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. You do not talk much about your brother. There is not much left to say, Calder replied. He was brave, he was kind. He was the only family I had left. You are kind too, she said, then looked down quickly. Calder set the hammer down and crossed the yard to her. He took the cup from her hands and set it aside before gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. You looked like a ghost that night, he said, walking through that storm, but you were the strongest thing I have ever seen. Mara's eyes filled again, but this time she did not look away. I was so scared, she whispered. But then I saw you and I thought, maybe I might make it. You did, Calder said. They stood close now, breath shared between them. Calder raised a hand slowly, giving her time to move away. She did not. When his palm cupped her cheek, she leaned into it, eyes fluttering shut. I never thought I would feel safe again, she whispered. You are safe now, he said. With me. And when their lips met, it was not desperate or rushed. It was warm, steady, solid as the earth beneath them. And for the first time in a long time, Mara smiled. The first frost came overnight, painting the meadow grass silver where it bent under the weight of it. Calder stepped outside before sunrise, his breath rising in plumes as he hauled wood from the stack beside the shed. Inside, he could hear Cade waking, small grunts and rustlings from the cradle. Mara's voice followed a moment later, low and steady, not singing this time but murmuring things only a mother would say. When Calder came back in, she was at the stove, her hair still damp from washing, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Cade lay wrapped on a folded quilt by the hearth, wide-eyed and chewing softly on his fingers. I ought to earn my keep, Mara said without turning. You've done more than enough. You don't owe me anything, Calder said, setting the wood beside the stove, but I'd be glad for the help. She finally looked over, brushing her hands on her skirt. I used to keep accounts for our neighbor back in Kansas. He ran a sawmill. I was good with numbers. Calder leaned against the edge of the table. There's a shop in town. Old man Redley's been needing someone to keep his ledgers straight. I can ask him. Her brow lifted, cautious. He wouldn't mind me being, she paused, not from here. He minds a lot, but not that, Calder said. He mostly minds people who waste his time. Mara gave a small nod, then turned back to the stove. Later that morning, Calder hitched the wagon again. The sun was bright on the snow patches, melting them into soft puddles over the trail. Cade was swaddled in a thick pelt and lay sleeping in Mara's arms. She rode beside Calder without speaking much, but her shoulders no longer held that tightness they'd carried when he first met her on the trail. As they passed into town, shop doors were open, and smoke rose from chimneys. Men hauled crates from wagons, and a few women stood near the well, drawing water and talking low. Calder guided the wagon around the back of the general store and helped Mara down. Redley was sitting on a stool outside, whittling something from a block of pine. He looked up, eyebrows disappearing beneath the brim of his hat. "You've brought company," he said, voice gravel thick. "This is Mara Lorne," Calder said. "She's got experience with numbers. You said you were drowning in receipts and couldn't make sense of your orders." Redley eyed Mara, then Cade, who had just begun to stir. "You married?" he asked. "Widowed," Mara said, steady. Redley grunted. "You write neat." "Very," he pointed toward the back door. "Tables inside. Ledgers on it. You can stay an hour. I'll see if you're worth keeping." Mara handed Cade to Calder without a word and disappeared inside. Cade blinked up at Calder, then hiccuped. Calder shifted him gently, pressing the boys back against his chest as he sat on the edge of the wagon bed. People walked by, a few nodded, most didn't. But Calder didn't mind. He watched the door and waited. When Mara came out again, she looked different, not in her clothes or her face, but something behind her eyes. Her chin was a little higher. "He gave me 2 weeks, she said. Calder smiled quietly. "Told you he didn't care where you're from." As they drove back along the trail, Mara kept her gaze on the hills in the distance. "My father taught me to write," she said. "He was a schoolteacher before the war. Said a woman should know more than how to boil potatoes and hem sleeves. What happened to him? Died in Virginia. He was a Union man, captured at Spotsylvania." She paused. "My mother died the winter after, fever." Calder didn't answer right away. The horses clopped steady over the rutted path. "You carry a lot without complaining," he said. "No one listens when you do," she replied. That evening, after Cade had gone down, Mara sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a stub of pencil Calder dug up from an old box. She kept glancing out the window where the last of the sun was sinking behind the ridge. "You don't say much about yourself," she said after a while. "There's less to tell than you think. Did you always live out here?" "No, grew up near Fort Bridger. My folks ran horses. My brother and I ran off at 16. Thought we'd be cattle kings by 20. Turns out cows are stubborn and land don't care who owns it." She looked over at him. "But you stayed." "I had nowhere else to go," he said, "and the cabin's quiet." "That's something?" She traced a line on the paper with her finger. "You fix things when they break." He looked up. "What do you mean? The cradle, the shed roof, Cade's bottle, me?" Calder didn't answer. She set the pencil down and walked over to the hearth. "I thought I was finished," she said. "Not just tired finished, but I'm not." He stood slowly, crossing the room to her. Her back stayed to him, but she didn't move away when he stepped beside her. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "Whatever you want," Calder said. "You call it." She turned then, her eyes not soft but sure. "I want to build something, not just survive it." "I'll help you," he said. "I know," she said. Outside, the wind had gone still. The fire crackled low and Cade sighed in his sleep. Calder reached out and took Mara's hand. She let him. Neither said another word. They didn't need to. The first snow held off longer than expected. Days stretched quiet and cold, the sun rising late and leaving early. Calder spent most mornings splitting wood, the ring of his axe carrying through the trees. Mara walked Cade down by the creek in the late afternoons, wrapped in a shawl Calder's mother had spun long ago, her boots crunching through frost-bitten leaves. There was peace, but not idleness, peace with a steady rhythm beneath it. One evening, as Calder returned from checking the trap lines, he found Mara sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the hearth, a pair of worn leather boots in her lap. She was working a needle through the left sole with careful precision. "Where'd you learn to cobble?" he asked, hanging his coat by the door. "My uncle. He lost his leg in the war but still made boots for the men who came through town," she said, not looking up. "He said a woman ought to know how to mend what feeds her." Calder knelt beside her, watching her thread the sinew. "You'd make a fine settler if you'd ever wanted that." "I used to think I did," she said, "but now I'm not sure I want land just to have it." I want a place that answers back when I speak, he nodded slowly. This place does if you stay long enough, she glanced over. Then maybe I'll stay. The next morning, Calder took Cade with him to the barn while Mara rode into town alone on the mare. Redley had asked her to help catalog the new shipment from Cheyenne grain sacks, nails, bolts of muslin. She'd left wearing one of Calder's old coats, sleeves rolled and pinned, her braid tucked beneath a wool cap. She squeezed his hand before mounting, her eyes bright in the early light. Cade fussed only once before settling into sleep in the sling across Calder's chest. Calder worked with the child nestled against him, mending the hinge on the barn door and clearing out the rotting hay from the corner stall. The boy slept through it all, warm and heavy, as though he'd always belonged there. By noon, snow had begun to fall in earnest thick flakes, slow and lazy. Calder stepped outside, rocking gently from foot to keep Cade asleep. The weight of the child, the soft hush of snow, the faint scent of hay and pine, it all settled in Calder's chest like something he'd never known he'd needed. When Mara returned, her cheeks were red from the ride and her gloves damp with melted snow. Redley asked me to come 3 days a week, she said, shaking the flakes from her sleeves. You want to? Calder asked. She nodded. He's not as mean as he pretends, just stubborn. Calder grinned. He'll have to learn what it means to lose a good legiman. That night, while Mara folded linens to store for winter, Calder sat carving a new spoon from a piece of aspen. Cade lay close beside them, gurgling now and then in his sleep. The light from the stove cast long, soft shadows across the room. I've thought about building another room, Calder said quietly, off the back just wide enough for a bed and a window. Mara looked up from the folded sheet. For what? For you, Calder said. If you want it. She watched him, hands still. Then she rose and sat beside him on the bench, close enough that their knees touched. I don't need a separate room, she said softly, unless you want one. He set the carving knife down. I don't. Her hand found his then, fingers sliding over his knuckles, slow and certain. Then build us something else. They didn't need more words. Not that night. The next morning, Mara brought out a small tin box from a bundle she'd kept tucked beneath her side of the bed. She opened it to show Calder inside was a ribbon from her wedding dress hem, a silver thimble, and a square of muslin embroidered with her mother's initials. These are the only things I carried from Kansas, she said. Everything else I left behind. Do you regret it? Calder asked. No, she said. I only wish I'd found this place sooner. He reached for her hand again, holding it between both of his. You're not carrying anything alone anymore. And Mara, who had crossed miles of bad road and worse silence, who had buried a husband and nearly lost herself to the cold, she nodded, and for once didn't have to be the strong one. Not here, not with him. Snow fell for days after that, but it never felt heavy. The sound of hammer strikes echoed through the trees, firm and deliberate. Calder stood on the back slope of the cabin, sleeves rolled past his elbows, sawdust clinging to his arms. The new addition was taking shape, not wide, but long enough to hold a second bed and narrow chest. He measured twice, cut once, the way his father had taught him. Inside, Mara knelt on the floor beside a bolt of dark wool she'd brought home from Redley's crates, hand stitching seams into a winter coat for Cade. The boy had grown heavier in the last weeks, his arms filling out, eyes tracking movement with a quickness that made Mara smile. She worked carefully, tongue caught at the corner of her mouth, each stitch neat, and even when Calder stepped in near dusk, she didn't look up. You've been out since before light, she said quietly. I got the rafters set. You're favoring your shoulder. It'll pass. Mara tied off her thread and set the coat aside. Let me see, she said, rising to her feet. I'm fine. Let me see. He hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt halfway down and turned slightly, revealing the bruised muscle along the edge of his shoulder blade. You tore something, she said. You've done it before. Years back. Loading a wagon near Fort Fetterman. She pressed her fingers carefully along the edge of the bruise. You never stop once you start something, do you? I don't see the point in halfway. She moved to the stove and poured hot water into a cloth, then pressed it gently against the darkening skin. Her touch was sure but light. Calder didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. "You don't have to carry it all," she said. "I know." She looked up. "Do you?" His eyes met hers. "I'm trying." That night, Mara placed the coat in progress beside Cade's cradle and joined Calder near the open window, where the last of the evening lights spilled over the hills. He had brought in a chair from the porch and sat with one leg stretched, his injured arm resting across his thigh. "I used to think stillness meant failure," she said softly. "That if I wasn't working, I wasn't worth anything." He turned slightly toward her. "And now I think stillness means I can finally hear myself think." He reached out, his hand grazing hers. "What do you hear?" "That I want things," she said. "Not just safety, not just a roof, but a life I choose." His expression didn't change, but his fingers closed around hers like a promise. The following week, Mara walked to the Hansen homestead, nearly a mile east, where Anna Hansen had just birthed a second daughter. Mara carried a jar of broth in one hand and a basket of cloth diapers in the other. She left Cade with Calder, who'd taken to carrying the boy in the sling while doing light chores. Cade had begun to mimic sounds, blowing spit bubbles and squealing when Calder whistled through his teeth. When Mara returned just before sundown, cheeks flushed from the wind, Calder met her at the edge of the clearing. "She all right?" he asked. "She's tired, but grateful." They walked back together, boots crunching softly in the thinning snow. "She asked how long we've been married," Mara said, glancing sideways. Calder let the pause settle before answering. "What did you say?" "I told her we hadn't yet decided." He stopped walking. "Do you want to?" Mara turned fully to face him, the last gold light of the sun catching in her hair. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I want Cade to grow up knowing what steady ground looks like. I want to wake up here beside someone who listens when I speak and doesn't flinch when I'm quiet." "I can give you that," Calder said, "if you'll have me." She studied him, brow furrowed. "I don't have a white dress, or anything fancy." "I'm not asking for fancy," he said. "I'm asking for you." She stepped forward and kissed him, not softly, but with a certainty that settled deep in his chest. A week later, they stood beneath the cottonwoods behind the cabin, with Anna Hansen and her husband as witnesses. Calder wore his cleanest shirt. Mara wore a dark blue dress she'd pieced together from scraps. Cade was tucked into Anna's shawl, asleep against her shoulder. There were no vows spoken beyond what was required. No flourishes. Just hands clasped, eyes steady, and words said with the kind of weight that didn't need repeating. That night, as wind moved quietly through the pines and the stove crackled low, Calder held Mara against him in the narrow bed they now shared. Her breath was warm across his neck, her hand resting over his heart. "You don't have to keep carrying me," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But I'll never let you fall." And in that quiet, with the snow beginning again outside and their sons sleeping safe beside them, they kept still. Not from weariness, but from peace. A peace they had built, plank by plank, word by word, until it stood strong enough to hold them both. Spring came slow to the hills west of Sheridan. Snow turned to slush, then mud, then finally to soft, damp earth that smelled of pine needles and thawed moss. The trees shook out their limbs and the creek behind the cabin ran higher with meltwater. The world was waking up. Mara stood in the doorway one morning, Cade on her hip, watching a pair of jays argue in the brush. The boy had begun to babble in earnest, reaching for everything with busy hands. She shifted his weight, kissed the top of his head, and turned as Calder came in from the barn, his boots crusted with drying mud. "I cleaned out the old coop," he said, setting down the empty feed sack. "Figured we could get hens from the McAllens. They're thinning their flock." "We'd need to repair the fencing," Mara said, adjusting Cade's bonnet. "It's dragging in the north corner." "I'll mend it this afternoon." She brushed Cade's hair back from his brow. "We never talked about planting." "I've got seed corn and beans in the cellar," Calder said, "and a patch cleared behind the shed. Wasn't sure if you'd want trouble with it this year." I do, she said. I want to put roots down. He crossed to her and pressed a kiss to her temple. Then we will. That week, she spent her mornings hoeing furrows while Cade napped in a sling against her back. Calder dug a second row each afternoon, working beside her until the sun dropped low. They planted together in silence, their movements in rhythm, the soil soft and dark beneath their fingers. When the last row was covered, Mara sat back on her heels and smiled, dirt streaked across one cheek. That's the first thing I've planted in 3 years, she said. Feels like breathing again. Calder offered his hand and she took it. Later, as they shelled dried beans by lantern light, Mara glanced up. Did you ever think about leaving after your brother died? I did, he said, even packed the wagon. Thought about heading south. What stopped you? He turned a dry bean between his fingers. He built this place with his hands, didn't feel right walking away from it. She reached across the table and laced her fingers with his. You didn't just stay. You made it more than what it was. He gave a small nod, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. In May, they rode into town as a family, Cade tucked into Calder's lap beneath a quilt as Mara guided the reins. She carried a ledger in her satchel, filled with neat lines of figures and orders for Redley's store. The old man had taken to leaving peppermint drops on her side of the desk, gruffly claiming they were leftover from someone else. After collecting supplies and trading dried apples for a length of linen, they stopped at the edge of the general store's porch. Calder adjusted Cade's cap. Do you miss Kansas? He asked. I used to, Mara said. It was all I knew, but I don't anymore. He looked at her, eyes steady. Is this home now? She nodded. It's the first place that's ever felt like one. That evening, they unpacked the wagon slowly. Cade played in the patch of grass near the porch, crawling after a pine cone with fierce determination. Mara carried the linen inside, then came back out and leaned against the doorframe, watching Calder stack sacks of flour in the shed. I've been thinking, she said. He straightened, dusting his hands. Dangerous, she smiled. I want to teach Cade at home when he's old enough. You still have your father's books, she nodded. And I saw a used reader in town. Redley said he'd hold it. Calder stepped forward, resting his arms on the porch rail. He'll learn from the best. That night, after Cade was asleep and the fire burned low, Calder took a small box from beneath the bed and placed it in Mara's lap. She opened it carefully. Inside was a silver comb, worn smooth with age, and a folded scrap of yellowed paper. It belonged to my mother, he said. She gave it to me the day I left Fort Bridger, told me to give it to the woman I built my life with. Mara held it gently in her palm. It's beautiful, she was, Calder said. So are you. She tucked the comb into her braid and reached for him. They sat close, heat rising between them as the cabin settled into evening stillness. By midsummer, the garden was thick with green shoots. Cade had begun to pull himself up on the edge of the cradle, testing his legs with small, determined grunts. Mara rose early to hang laundry beneath the eaves, the sun warm on her shoulders. Calder rode out some mornings to help a neighbor build a fence, returning by dusk with a bottle of molasses or a sack of flour in trade. They lived steady. Together. One morning in August, Calder whittled Cade a small horse from a scrap of pine. The boy clutched it tightly, dragging it through the dirt outside the porch while Mara sat mending a tear in the quilt. You've been quiet, Calder said softly. She looked up, her fingers still. I'm late, he blinked. How late? Long enough to be sure. He crossed to her slowly, kneeling before her on the porch. Are you well? I feel strong, she said. And ready. He rested his hand over hers. Then we'll make room. In the months that followed, they did just that. Calder built a second cradle from the same maple his brother had once used. Mara sewed by lamplight, her belly growing round. Cade learned to toddle along the edge of the rug, laughing when Calder scooped him into the air. Winter came again, slower this time. The storm winds seemed gentler, snow falling without malice. Inside the cabin, warmth glowed from the stove and the rooms held the sound of life. On a cold morning in February, Mara gave birth to a daughter. Calder held her in one arm, Cade in the other, both children wrapped in wool. Mara rested beneath the quilt, skin pale but eyes bright. "She has your mouth," she whispered. "She has your fire," he whispered back. They named her Clara after Mara's mother. Years passed as they tend to do, but the cabin never emptied. The children grew into steady, kind souls, Cade with hands always reaching for tools, Clara with eyes that saw straight through to the truth of things. Mara taught them to read, to count, to wonder. Calder taught them to build, to mend, to stay. And through every season, they loved each other with the same quiet steadiness that had first carried them through the sleet and mud. No storms came that they couldn't weather together. And every night, once the lamps were trimmed and the children tucked beneath quilts, Calder and Mara lay side by side in the home they had built from loss, from hope, from days earned piece by piece. Together always.